Hello everyone. In a previous episode, we talked about the cosmopolitan character of the Roman Empire. That is the diverse, multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious qualities of Rome, and how Rome inspired modern-day ideas of cross-cultural acceptance and equality. Yet, however, in a previous episode, we also talked about how ideas are simply tools. It is up to the individual to interpret and apply ideas which determine whether an idea is liberating or restrictive of one's freedoms. Ideas are simply tools that individuals could apply in an infinite number of ways. And for today's episode, we are talking about how Rome evoked this multicultural heritage to rationalize imperial expansion. Believing in the unity of all peoples laid the foundation for a widespread and expansive empire, for ideas of universal rule. That is a universal and globe-spanning empire. And this is one of the reasons why Stoicism was so attractive to many Romans. Believing that all human beings shared a logos served to unify a diverse plurality of peoples throughout the empire into a single culture, all leading back to Rome. Taking the Stoic idea that all human beings have a similar divine logos in them essentially led to the idea that all human beings are potentially the same, which leads to the idea that sure, anyone could become a Roman citizen, and this anyone could be from any culture, any civilization, any society, and any religion. In a sense, every human being is potentially equal. Although in theory, anyone could become a Roman citizen, it was not actually like that in reality. Because yeah, Stoicism argued that we are all equal. Stoicism also had a class dimension to it, or an intelligence dimension to it. Some parts of Stoic philosophy divided humans up. You had the wise, intelligent human beings, and you had the dumbasses. All human beings are potentially equal, but in reality, they are not equal. Only the wise could cultivate reason. Only the wise could tap into their divine logos and channel it. The idiots and the fools cannot do this. The idiots and fools have to be controlled. They have to be educated. They have to be subjugated. This lofty ideal that all human beings are potentially equal eluded the majority of Rome's citizens. Now, the Roman Stoics observed their world from their imperial capital of Rome. According to Cicero, the Roman Empire had a mission to civilize the world's peoples. Cicero characterized the Roman Empire as the protectorate of the world. The imperial capital of Rome was the link in the chain which bound all the world's peoples together. No matter how different their culture was, no matter how different their beliefs were, no matter how different their ways of acting were. In fact, by the 1st century, many Roman citizens simply identified the Roman Empire as the world. Now, this does not mean that the Romans ignored peoples outside the Roman Empire. Far from it. The Romans possessed a lively ethnography characterizing all the peoples outside the Roman empires they had encountered. Take China, for example. The Romans knew China existed. They just assumed that one day the Chinese would become Romans and be absorbed into the world capital, which they believed to be Rome. Indeed, Rome westernized peoples that many in our modern times do not regard as part of Western civilization. Take the Arabs, for example. Many of them were Roman citizens who assimilated into Roman society, into Roman ways. Take, for example, Emperor Philip I, or also known as Philip the Arab, who comes from modern-day Syria. Modern-day genetic studies show that the imperial capital of Rome contained peoples from the modern Mediterranean, including North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, along with the modern-day European parts. One of the most influential Christian Romans, Augustine of Hippo, originated from Roman Africa, from the province of Numidia. Scholars have speculated that he was of Berber descent, a modern peoples which still exist in our contemporary times. However, Augustine, they also argue, was fully Romanized into Roman culture, including Christianity. And also, appropriately, the founder of Stoicism himself, Zeno of Citium. Zeno was of Phoenician origin, and another Greek described him as, quote, dark thick-skinned. Thus, the Romans could be remarkably cosmopolitan. After all, those who were rational, humanity's wisest peoples, were already peoples living within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. Barbarians were those people who lived outside the bounds, peoples who did not adopt Roman culture for themselves. Yet in spite of all this, Roman elites continued to champion their multinational culture, their multinational heritage. The Roman poet Virgil, for example, described Rome as a place where, quote, wild races have been gathered together by Saturn and given laws. And so you could begin to see how the idea of Stoicism, that peoples are fundamentally equal, was employed to justify empire building, was used to justify Rome adding province after province, city after city into its empire. The Roman Empire was a culture, a society without limits, without borders. Indeed, the Roman poet Ovid made this explicitly clear. Take, for example, his story of Terminus. Terminus was the ancient Roman god of boundaries. He was a god who kept the peace, for he prevented violent disputes between properties and fields. According to one legend, when the Romans were constructing and dedicating a new temple to Jupiter, all the gods made space, all except one. Faithful and true to his duty, Terminus did not budge. He was obstinate in the face of the most powerful god, and therefore the temple was built around him. The god of boundaries was bounded by the new temple. The god in charge of creating demarcations was trapped, and therefore could no longer create boundaries for the eternal city of Rome. Such a myth caused Ovid to reflect, quote, the lands of the other races have fixed boundaries. The extent of the city of Rome and the world is one. That is, Rome has no boundaries. Rome has no borders. Rome and the world are exactly the same. They are synonymous with each other. To be a citizen of the world is to be a citizen of Rome. Fundamentally, the idea of a Rome without end was an ideology of endless empire building, of endless wars, of endless expansion. The idea of Rome and the Stoic heritage as being an ideology of expansion was visible in several different figures from classical antiquity. Take Tacitus, for example, a famous Roman historian. He loved the Roman Empire, thought it was glorious, thought it was superior to all the savages around the world. But he believed it to be deeply, deeply flawed, corrupt, and degenerate. As a result, he criticized Roman society greatly while still loving it in the end, but conversely, he admired the qualities of peoples he considered to be savages. In regard to the Germans, he believed that they were a primitive people, but a noble people, that these savages were somehow purer than the corrupt degenerates which inhabit the civilization of humanity. And Tacitus wrote much over Romanization. That is the assimilation into Roman culture, that is patterns of thinking, beliefs, and ways of acting in the world. Romanization being the process of becoming a Roman. For example, he thought the inhabitants of Britannia and Gaul were well on their path to becoming Roman citizens. He took it as a foregone conclusion that the Britons and Gauls would just become Roman one day. They had started wearing the toga and had started taking the Roman style of bathing, which he mocked them for. Foreshadowing Rousseau, he noted that the Britons and Gauls used the term civilization for the slavery and chains that they put on themselves. Yet he considered the Germans, the Batavians, and the Frisians to be partly Romanized, but this partial assimilation into Roman society gave them all the information that they needed to know. And the reason why he believed that these tribes still held out against Rome is that he believed that they could see the flaws in Roman society, even though it was a superior society. He admired these savages for at least seeing the corruption that harbored inside of Rome. Now, although Tacitus was well aware of the evils of Roman society, he considered the expansion of Rome to be inevitable. For him, the Roman Empire was a necessary evil, and an evil necessity is fundamentally still a necessity. He simply could not imagine an alternative to Roman civilization. And so, in many ways, Roman society was full of contradictions. In fact, one historian called it Janus-faced. Janus-faced meaning double-sided, hypocritical, or contradictory. Another historian argues that our modern 21st century ideas of racism can be traced all the way back to stereotypes and prejudices from the Romans themselves. And indeed, it would be a mistake to characterize Roman society as some cosmopolitan utopia open to all peoples around the world. It was that, but it was that to a certain point. Beyond that point, you had stratification, prejudice, and all types of inequalities. The Romans, just like us moderns, had a weird blend of acceptance and xenophobia, of claiming all people are equal, but at the same time saying not those people over there, those people are definitely not equal to us. This is also evident when we speak about Roman citizenship. Now, many Romans regarded being foreigner within Rome as being a transitory state, like, oh, this is a guy who's speaking crap Latin, but in a few years he will be speaking perfect Latin. He's just hasn't reached that point yet. And so many Romans considered barbarians and foreigners in their empire to be essentially in the process of becoming Romans. Now, the Roman Cato had something to say about individuals being from multiple cultures. In regards to the Italians outside of Rome, he said, quote, "Surely I think that he and all natives of Italian towns have two fatherlands, one by nature and the other by citizenship." Thus, to some extent, the Romans were somewhat tolerant of peoples belonging to different cultures. Now, I say somewhat because there's a caveat to this. Oftentimes, Romans argued what it meant to be a real Roman. And in general, it was really bad to be an ethnic type, an hyphenated Roman. And you saw many of these accusations come to the fore during Roman politics. Politicians would accuse their political opponents of not being Roman enough, or as peoples being too attached to their barbarian culture to qualify as a true Roman. And becoming Roman, one had to do several things. You had to worship the Roman gods and eventually adopt Christianity. You had to learn Latin, and in the eastern provinces, Greek. The Romans expected a complete makeover of the people they let into their society. They expected the peoples that they incorporated to assimilate into the culture of the imperial core. And important to note is that the Romans did not consider the Roman Empire to be multicultural as we understand it in our modern day times. The Roman Empire was made up of different cultures, but not multicultural. This is a very important difference. The Romans had a hierarchy of culture. They had zero respect for foreign cultures and saw no reason why they should preserve alien cultures. Thus, Rome welcomed all sorts of peoples from different cultures and societies, but only if those people left their cultures behind. For the Romans, Roman culture was superior. There were exceptions for the Greeks and the Etruscans, but everyone else was basically a bunch of barbarians who were lucky to be in the world empire of Rome. So yes, they were cosmopolitan and open-minded only if you met certain conditions. And this interaction between cross-cultural acceptance, assimilation, and prejudice was fundamentally what supported the endless empire building of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was the world, and all the peoples outside of the Roman Empire were simply just waiting to be incorporated into the empire of humanity that they called Rome. And indeed, you could see this ideology in a simple phrase from Seneca, who said, quote, "We should look neither to this corner nor to that, but measure the boundaries of our nation by the sun." That is, Rome is the world and the world is Rome. That is why the Romans could sound remarkably utopian and open-minded. They would use terms like the common patria, which basically meant that the world was essentially one giant country waiting to be united under the Roman Empire. And many historians have argued that the Roman Empire was not defined by the single city of Rome, but by a way of life supported by Roman ideas of law, justice, and civilization.